Welcome to the GemLabs podcast. My name is Gabor Farkas, and I'm your host. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sandy Chong for a conversation about AI inclusion in the context of building something constructive and good for the future. Sandy brings her Australian and Asian experience to this issue. This will allow us to explore how these opportunities look from the perspective of different cultures. Sandy will be in Geneva for the World Trade Organization Public Forum and will be one of the panelists of the discussion GemLabs is organizing on Friday the 13th. It is session 108, which will take place in room B between 9 and 10:30. The panel discussion is titled Empowering Inclusive Global Trade Through AI. In a recent conversation I had with Dmitry Grozhubinsky, the author of the book Why Politicians Lie About Trade, we talked about issues that will probably also be discussed in this session. You can find a link to my conversation with Dmitry on our website. I have to mention that during the recording of this podcast with Sandy, I experienced some technical difficulties. It was my first time using a new podcast software. My apologies for a few glitches in the sound quality. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sandy Chong for a conversation about AI inclusion in the context of building something constructive and good for the future. Sandy brings her Australian and Asian experiences to this issue. This will allow us to explore how these opportunities look from a perspective of different cultures. Sandy, your resume is quite impressive, and you seem to be involved in many projects in Australia, Singapore, and Europe. Rather than risking overlooking anything important, I think it would be easier for you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you very much, Gabor. It's a real pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Sandy. I'm the principal for Verity Consulting, but I wear many other hats as well. So I was the president for the United Nations Association here in Western Australia. I'm the chair for the ASEAN Business Alliance, which is a coalition of business councils representing the Southeast Asian countries to promote trade and investment. I am also the state director for the Australian Harvard Women, and my job is to really help promote more women into executive education program, MBA programs, essentially culture and nurture more female leaders. So that's just a few things I do. I also wear other hats as the ESG advisor for our First Nation people here, the Noongar Chamber of Commerce. I was the director at the WA Indigenous Tourism Council. So the Indigenous culture is also something that is very close to my heart. I'm also very keen on supporting women who are migrants, people with culturally and linguistically diverse background. So those are just some of the few things that I advocate. But essentially, I'm the biggest fan of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we've been doing a series of Sustainable Development Goals Forum series here in Western Australia since 2018.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's quite impressive. When do you find time to sleep?
Probably not a lot, but it's okay. Like meditation helped. Yeah.
So we should maybe begin by framing today's conversation.
Sure.
Can you please elaborate on what AI inclusion means in the context of building a positive future with AI?
Yes, a lot of times you hear people talk about digital inclusion, AI inclusion. I just thought I'd start by differentiating the two of them. So digital inclusion means you have access to digital knowledge, digital infrastructure, and also the technology and application for you to, say, for example, access simple things like Wi-Fi or have a computer, a mobile phone, and so on and so forth. So AI inclusion is slightly different from digital inclusion. AI inclusion means like when you're designing it, when you're developing it, and when you are deploying these AI technologies like the generative AI, have we actually considered and integrate like multiple perspectives in the coding, in the algorithm, the needs and values from all segments of society, including the ones that are underrepresented and also marginalized, or in some cases they do not have access to these digital infrastructure because they live in rural areas or they live in countries or regions where they have very poor infrastructure for digital. Yeah. And what does it mean to be building a positive future with AI? I suppose in order to make sure that everyone is going to be considered in terms of benefiting from this technology and also closing the wealth gap, I think it's important to, in the front of mind when we develop these technologies and when we come up with inventions, we needed to use the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG goals, the 17 goals, as guidelines to see, okay, if any of these inventions or any of these applications actually help, number one, reduce poverty, number two, reduce hunger, generate better quality of education, have a more sustainable community, improving not just innovation in infrastructure, but also providing decent work for people. So I can go on and on about this, but we can unpack a little bit in the interview.
Yes, you certainly have framed it well enough so for our listeners to understand what we will be talking about today.
Sure.
How can different cultures contribute to making AI more inclusive and beneficial for everyone?
Yes, I believe that different cultures obviously can be dictated by the way people are being brought up, different languages they speak, and also different religion. And so I would say all this will make it very rich for AI because AI is like I would say like a baby trying to learn and it's trying to absorb everything at the same time and coming up with solutions, right? So we all know like garbage in, garbage out. So we need to nudge it. We need to train it when we also need to give it the right information. I always tell people if you want AI to be really diverse and you also want AI to be a little bit more considerate, more kind, more compassionate, then or even creative in solving some of the major challenges that we face today, then we need to feed it with information. And obviously, some cultures have very simple language structure, and some other cultures have more complex language structure. The Indian, Latin Slavic languages, or Chinese, or some of these languages in Asia. So when you have different culture coming in, bringing very unique perspective and different kind of knowledge system, that can really help make the AI solution a lot more robust. And with regards to localizing the solution, obviously, different cultures will have different nuances, different sense of family, the relationship with the society, collectivism or individualism. By having different cultures putting information into these solutions, then obviously we can tailor it to specific needs locally. In some cultures, it is extremely important to have freedom of speech. And so how do you govern that? And not just having freedom of speech, but actually making sure that the information you put out there is not disinforming people, is not misinforming people. In other cultures, freedom of speech is less important, and it's more about collective harmony, right? Or making sure that the information that we communicate out there does not offend any other cultures, does not offend any other religion, right? Different regions will have different cultural preferences, and so we need to take that into consideration. So if you want to make it more relevant, if you want people to trust this particular technology, trust is a really big thing, right? If people don't trust it, people don't use it because they feel that they might be abused or they feel that the information that they provide might be perverse or might be taken out of context. This is also the reason why we need more culturally diverse information in there. I would also like to remind people that 88% of the world population is non-Western, and about 60% of the world population is actually residing in Asia. A lot of these solutions are created in the Silicon Valleys in the world, supported by a huge digital economy in India. And it needs to take into consideration cultures and also languages and also preferences from, say, South America, Africa, Middle East, Asia. And just within Asia itself, I'm an Asian, I was born in Singapore, but not all Asians are equal or the same. So that the AI adoption is quite different from Singapore compared to Vietnam, and then from Vietnam compared to Japan, and so on and so forth. And also, not all Asians are similar. So Vietnamese are not the same as Filipinos. Filipinos are not the same as Singaporean. Singaporeans are definitely not the same as Indonesians, so on and so forth. So people need to think, like, when you think of Asia, don't just think of China or Japan. There are 700 million people living out of China and Japan and Korea, Hong Kong and Taiwan. And when I talk about Southeast Asia, that's quite a large population, and we're very diverse, extremely different from one culture to another, and also languages. So when you look at building trust in such a diverse world, in such a diverse community or region, then you need to take into consideration a number of factors, right? I would say there are a number of ethical frameworks that people can follow to make sure that AI can be more inclusive and beneficial for everyone. But again, different cultures and different traditions would also have different level of knowledge system. Some could be very holistic and community-based, whereas others could be more about sustainability and responsibility to the community. So it's a little bit different for everyone. Some cultures, their ethical framework is more about self-governing. So this concept of making sure that you're responsible for yourself and so on, whereas in some other culture, it tends to be more patriarchal, where the government or the leader of the company needs to take responsibility for the application of these solutions because it affects their community, because it affects their workforce, and also it affects their citizen. Hopefully that gives you some context and why culture is so important in development.
Yes, it makes me think about something that we sometimes overlook. Culture and language, and the way the language is spoken, will contribute often to thought patterns within society. And the data that we feed AI and the information that AI receives through this data is not a reflection on the thought patterns that might be existing in different cultures. Is that important to work on, to bridge, so that we can understand how the thought pattern that exists within a given culture attached to a given language leads to certain ways of looking at things?
Yes, of course. I'll give you an example. The word artificial intelligence has the word artificial in it, right? There were some philosophers who are actually questioning whether English is equipped or English is good enough to develop future AI systems or future AI solution, because by just thinking about the word artificial, you're already putting this particular advancement or this particular solution into a box, saying that they're machine or they're not real. So I often ask people, what do you think of the moment you hear the word artificial? Some people think, oh, it's not real, it's fake, it's man-made, and so on. I'm not saying it's negative, but it's definitely something that is not part of human. It's other, right? For some of the cultures, for example, Mandarin, the word artificial intelligence is being translated into some other forms, superior intelligence, or say, for example, super intelligence, those sort of things. So there's some human aspect to it, and we treated it.
What would be the translation?
The translation, you're talking about Mandarin or English?
Yes, Mandarin, for instance.
Yeah, so some people call it 人工智能. So it's like human man-made intelligence, right? Man-made intelligence. So it's like an extension of human. So the word human is actually in the word called artificial intelligence. With some of the cultures, they don't have that at all. It's just artificial. So I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I think the way we use our languages do govern the way we think. And therefore, it would also influence the way we develop the program or develop the particular solution, and so on and so forth. But if you compare with me, the way I prepare for a talk recently at the AI for Good Global Summit is that I encourage people to look at some ancient philosophy and wisdom when you look at evolution of human and also evolution of technology. So with the indigenous community, for example, over here in Australia, we have this First Nation people, their history have been around for over 30,000 years. Yeah. And they do not privilege or they do not prize human life to be above and more important than the nature. Just because you're not a human doesn't mean you can't be my brother or sister or mentor. So even if you're an animal like a dog or a cat, a dolphin, you could still be connected with me somehow. All right. So the way they see it is, okay, so if I have this artificial intelligence, do I look at it from a lens of this is a machine, it's only there to work for me, or do you look at it from a lens of this is superior intelligence or super intelligence, and how can we make sure that this particular intelligence is produced in our image and making sure that it's going to help our community, help our society, and also help our future generation. So the indigenous culture here, very similar like the Chinese, they have this thing called 7th-generation stewardship. So that means you're not just thinking about AI 1.0, AI 2.0, you're thinking about AI 70.0 or AI 65.0. So you're literally looking at a span of 140 years, right? Because 7th-generation, roughly about 140 years. How AI is going to impact on, and how do we imagine AI to be? What kind of problem are they trying to solve for us? There are some scholars who have done studies between West and East, and they were saying that there seems to be a little bit more fear and paranoia in some of the articles that come out from the West. And then they were wondering why in the East there less of that paranoia. So again, like from an Asian perspective, and I'm just going to transit into Asia because I'm an Asian, and our culture is very much influenced by three things, Taoism, Confucianism, and also Buddhism. And if you look at Buddhism, it's very much everything changes in life. That is a constant. There's nothing you can do to stop anything from changing. So if this is something that is a natural evolution or natural progression of humankind, then we just need to accept it. And the way we accept it is, okay, let's have a look at how it could be made in our image. And that is, again, being governed by Confucianism. So Confucianism is a social structure that has been around for thousands of years and very much adopted by the Japanese, Korean, and most of Southeast Asia, right? Even if they don't speak Chinese like the Vietnamese or the Singaporeans. Singapore, we do speak Mandarin. We have Chinese education, but say, for example, Thailand. But a lot of that influence comes from this Confucianism where there is a fixed social structure of how the kind of roles that leaders should take, law, scholars, and so on, and that we should always govern ourselves with ethics and compassion, right? So sometimes what is good for the community is more important than what is good for individual, right? That's a little bit different from the West. Not that it's right or wrong, it's just different, right? You have the right to not wear a face mask. But you also have to have the responsibility of taking care of the elderly and the people who are vulnerable. So in Asia, it's a no-brainer, right? During COVID, the sense of responsibility is more important than right. Okay, not that people don't appreciate rights or privacy or whatever. It's just that the sense of responsibility is much more heavier because it's a very collective kind of society. You have to take care of the old and the vulnerable, and therefore that prides over individual freedom of speech or even individual rights to say speak of your own belief or whatever. So it's governed really carefully. I think this is the difference between the culture. And this is also what's governing most of the way Asians look at technology and the way they look at AI moving forward. Yeah.
It is very interesting to hear you talk about this Asian perspective and how AI is considered. I have one concern. It's not about deciding whether AI is to be accepted as a normal or regular evolution of how we move on with life. It's how individual humans can use it for malicious intent.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a major concern, but maybe we'll get into that a
Sure.
little bit later.
Sure.
What challenges do we face in achieving equitable AI developments across cultures?
Yeah, I think that is a good question. I think other than making sure that there are enough ideas, people of different cultural background, coming from different diverse socioeconomic demographics to come in and basically provide these data and making sure that these data are rigorous and can be very robust. I think the other challenges could be really, I have to say, digital infrastructure. Like while we talk about AI, generative AI, for example, there's still a lot of regions in the world that do not have access to Wi-Fi. It's still very disruptive in terms of very spotty when you try to get access to Wi-Fi. So until that has been resolved, it's going to be a big issue and that gap is just going to be widened. When I say the gap, I'm not just talking about wealth gap, I'm talking about digital gap, right? Something that Bill Gates had talked about like more than 20 years ago. So people with access to technology and information will basically and naturally get access to faster data and more data and be more informed and therefore be wealthier or healthier. People without that is going to be left behind. And like you said, abuses of AI technology has already started since last year. And we need a governing body or we need countries to get together and make sure that the way we use it, the way we apply it does not abuse human rights, does not basically take away human responsibility to ourselves, and making sure that the kind of future that we build is going to be the future that is going to empower people, not disempower people, not to incriminate people, not to devoid people from having a healthy job, having a decent kind of purpose in life. Because for a lot of people, jobs are not just there to make an income for financial stability, but it's also there for their dignity. So I think this is why it's not just about governance, right? The governance framework is important, and there are many different ethical standards out there. And many countries, especially in EU, they're looking at this regulation and legislation and creating this kind of governance framework, which is really good. But again, these governance framework do sometimes get educated by your upbringing, what is considered ethical, right? What's considered unethical. And so I think transparency is one thing, fairness is another, and of course holding people accountable, right? We've gone through Web 1.0, Web 2.0, and now we're in Web 3.0. Everyone was really excited about Web 1 when it came burst into scene in mid-90s. And then there was like a bubble burst, and then it's just part of that whole consolidation phase. And then a few of the big winners then start to prevail. And then you have Web 2.0, where everyone thought, oh, user-generated content would be awesome. It's a way to connect with our community. It's a way to share our ideas with people that in the past we weren't able to do. But then after social media has burst into scene, about 15 years later, we are starting to see a lot of negative impact, right? The rise in teenage suicide rate, people augmenting their features because they wanted to reach these impossible beauty standards. You also have people hacking into people's information, then abusing those information and then scamming people. Like Asia, for example, we have about $1 trillion worth of scams every year in this region. And it's all because it's so easy to hack into information on your personal computers, into even your mobile phone as well, if you haven't got the right application to secure yourself. So let's not make the same mistake again with Web 3.0. Let's not wait another 17 years to figure out, oh, how can human beings be more deprived? We need to start now to make sure that we build these trusts in the AI system, we promote transparency, and we make sure that they are there to serve the common good.
It's very dense, this topic, and you bring a lot of issues to the forefront of our conversation, and it to address all the issues at the same time. It deserves maybe separate conversations for each one of them. There's one thing that's really interesting when you were talking about Web 1.0 and Web 2.0, and now some people are thinking that AI is going to have an impact on human creation and content creation, and that might be going away with the Web 0.30. So human content creation will be replaced by AI content creation. That's in question. Previously, or just before, you mentioning how AI is the word artificial intelligence is used in different languages and might have different meanings. And that's also very interesting to take into account. So maybe because English is the number one language spoken around the world, it has a very important impact and maybe influences other languages not in a positive way, because we've framed it AI being as artificial intelligence. Maybe if we had called it augmenting intelligence, it would have had a better impact. Maybe we should come up with a different way of calling AI and not just Apple intelligence, which might be the next thing after the recent presentation by Apple.
Someone was asking me during a talk when I was at this AI for Good Global Summit. This Korean guy put up his hand and he was saying, if we don't want to call it AI, what should we call it if we don't want to call it artificial intelligence? And I can see in his eyes, because the two of us are both Asians and we grew up with manga and animation and stuff. And it's very common in a lot of our sci-fi film and also sci-fi literature that, you have these super intelligence or super species or intelligent species, and we call it as such, but we just don't use the word artificial in there. So that's something that we might want to consider in the future. But that is if we come to a point where we can reconcile with the fact that this will be the next evolution of human being, right? I think a lot of people just feel really scared, and people naturally feel scared about things that they don't understand and they don't trust, or they have no idea how it's going to impact their lives. But if this is inevitable, right, like what we said, we cannot put a stop to AI. There is no way we can reverse this. Then when we come to terms with it, what are we going to call these intelligence? Are they going to be an extension of our current human race? Or are they going to be treated differently? Or are they, because it's really important. If we treat these AI differently, so say, for example, we think that they're just machine and we're going to abuse them. We treat them like a machine, and therefore we don't see them as an entity with feelings, with emotions, with thoughtfulness. Then it's going to be very dangerous for us, because you don't know what are the consequences and ramification of that reaction, especially nowadays when we can code and we can make all these programming of AI to start having feelings, right? It's just neuron interaction and connection. I think, if anything, it really forces us to really reflect how we treat each other as human beings. We talked about diversity and inclusion for a long time, but we never thought of pinning it down and measuring it. And now with AI, this conversation is really heightened, because everyone was just saying, as human beings, we already have unconscious bias. Can you imagine if we have an AI that only reflects 12% of the world population? It's just going to perpetuate. And whatever we think we have unconscious bias of, it's just going to be worse. So having these kind of rigorous conversations is actually a good thing, because then we can then say, okay, how do we measure it then? How can we make sure that this thing does not perpetuate the kind of unconscious bias we already have as humans? Yeah, I hope AI is going to make us human beings behave better, not worse.
Hopefully, we are not at a point where we can say that AI has emotions yet.
Yeah.
And for the
not
12%, I'm not sure it's even 12%, because apparently women are really very much left out of the data that is being used to feed AI. So it's maybe just 6% of the population.
Yeah, now I always tell people the largest consumers in the world are not the Chinese, actually the women. Even from a commercial perspective, when you design these AI, when you collect these data and then you make something meaningful out of it in terms of customer service or marketing, have you considered women's perspective, right? How have you considered how women consume a particular product? How do they actually then share it with their families and their friends? And what do they use it for? How frequent? And so demographics, you have geographics, but then you also have behavioral information and psychographical information that are usually harder to get. But those last two information is going to help inform you make better business decisions or make better governmental, political, or even legislative decisions. How do people behave? right? So this is where the big data comes in. And is your data rigorous enough to represent the more than 50% of the population? Yeah, women.
It's a very important way of changing our perspective, but this has to evolve with the way we see the world and the way we understand it. And you were bringing up, or you brought up Buddhism and Taoism. And I remember a long conversation I had with this Buddhist monk. And there was one thing on which our perspectives differed,
Mm.
which is that I thought or considered that trees have a consciousness. And he said, no, trees don't have consciousness. So that's an interesting perspective to take into account. And I don't know how you will bring Buddhism with what science has shown today is
Yeah.
that trees very well may have consciousness.
Yes, yes. So again, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but if you look at some of the indigenous cultures, you have animate and inanimate objects. So animate means a tree, and then inanimate object could be the wooden table that you have in your house. The way Aboriginal considered is that, yes, this is a tree, it has a spirit, but the table will have a spirit too, because the table is from the wood, is from the tree, and therefore it has a spirit. Just because it is not an animate object doesn't mean that it doesn't have a spirit in there. So it really questions about, do you have a soul? Does the AI have a soul? And does the AI have a spirit? And how do we define spirit and soul and all that? What makes us human, right? And when we are no longer around, when our body fade away and age and pass away, do we still have spirits, right? Some people believe that spirit exists even if the body doesn't, whereas some other cultures don't believe in that. So this is starting to go into the line of how are we going to treat these AIs in the future. When we pass on, people are already starting to use AI to capture memories and capture speaking patterns, behaviors of our loved ones. And do they then encapsulate the spirit or soul of the people or the humans that have passed on, right? So then is this ethical as well? Like this question of ethics, like it's people wanted to reconcile with their loved ones, and obviously they wanted to always be able to talk to their loved one even they pass on. But then what if people couldn't move on? What if people couldn't move on and they couldn't move on with their life, they couldn't move on with a new family, or they couldn't move on with their work, and they live in this world that is just completely unreal? Is that ethical? So this question about ethics is really something that is quite interesting, and it can be controversial, or can have very many kind of disagreements or perspective. But I said fundamentally, all ethics are more or less the same. It's just there to govern us human behavior, to make sure that we do not do anything bad, we do not hurt someone else, right? But it does differ a little bit. Like in Asia, the ethics often focuses on collective well-being and societal harmony. That's much more important than individual rights or speaking rights or freedom of speech or privacy rights and so on. In Europe, the ethics most of the time prioritize on the individual rights and making sure that the technology that we create tends to be more human-centric, and privacy is extremely important, yeah. And then in the US, it's slightly different. It's more about innovation, the spirit of entrepreneurship, and balancing the regulation with the freedom to innovate. Because America is great because it has created all these amazing innovators and entrepreneurs in the world. So that is actually more prized. Yeah, I think like all things, we need to take everything into consideration and then see if we can come out with a balance. You can't say, let's just let these tech companies do whatever they want and then deal with the consequences later. That's so irresponsible in the eyes of Asians. Or say, for example, let's just use this technology to map this land and then find the best deposits for gold or critical minerals and so on. But in the perspective of indigenous people, these lands have spirits, right? It's not just the Amazon you're looking at. The Amazon, underneath the Amazon, you have trees. And underneath the trees, who do you have? You have rubber tappers, you have farmers, you have teachers, you have workers. So at the end of the day, it does impact us humans. And we need to make sure that every time when we say, oh, technology can help us do this, or AI can help us do that, we need to ask further questions like, how is this impacting on the land? How is this impacting on the people who live on the land? And how is this going to impact our environment? And more importantly, our social construct, how we relate to people and so on. So you will see that as well. Like when different regions of the world look at AI development, they're focusing a little bit more on different sectors of the industry. Yeah.
Yes, we should not forget that many of the innovators, those who contribute to fast-moving innovation in the US, actually migrants who were coming from different parts
Yeah,
of the world,
absolutely.
notably from Asia.
Yes. Yes.
They tend to a little bit forget their cultural origins when they have moved there, or they're taken over by other kind of pressures to move their innovation forward.
Yes, and I think this is what makes some country great, because you start new, you come to a new country, it's a young country, very much like Australia, and you can do whatever you want, right? You don't have that burden of history or traditions and so on. So that's great. But we all know that learning from other people is really not the best way to go. Sometimes we really need to learn from our history. We really need to learn from the elder generation. They've been there, they've done that. Maybe consult them, have a look. I think humans have this tendency to keep repeating the same mistake again, thinking that we can always avert the next disaster by doing something different, only to come back to the same point.
I think you're reminding everybody what's the definition of insanity.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to, again, my culture again, right? Like Taoism, everything is about yin and yang, a balance, and everything flows like a water. And you also need to understand that in the lens of Buddhism, life itself, to be born and then to die, I think it's the same in Hinduism as well, is suffering. Do you interfere? Do you not interfere? Do you take a very passive approach? Do you take a very active approach? Everything needs to be in balance. Yeah.
You just reminded everybody the main difference between Asian culture and Occidental or European or, yes, Occidental culture. The idea of suffering and the idea of happiness.
Yeah.
Happiness is a given in the Occidental culture, and suffering is natural, normal. And when you have happiness, you have to grab it.
Yeah.
And when you don't have happiness in Occidental culture, you're just miserable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other day I was talking to my friend about this, and I said, there's no such thing as a happy life. You have happy moments in your life. And the way Asians see it is enjoy it while it lasts, because they're just momentums. There's no point chasing it. So this pursuit of happiness is sometimes can be very futile, because then you would come up with all kinds of... I remember 20 years ago, I read this book about what is the meaning of happiness, and then the book went down this rabbit hole of human beings trying to manufacture happiness through drugs, through all kinds of artificial means to maintain that particular high in the chemicals in your brain. So that's very unnatural, because the moment you try to pursue it too actively or too stubbornly, you are devoid of happiness. You can let it come naturally. So I think this is also the kind of attitude that most Asians have, right? That you just accept what life gives you and then you just go with the flow. You just go with the...
Maybe we should explore what are some concrete examples of AI projects that demonstrate the positive impact of cultural inclusion.
Sure. So if you're looking at some of the main actors of AI inclusion in the Asia Pacific region, you can look at, say, for example, in Singapore, you have the National University of Singapore. They lead a lot of research and initiatives in AI and ethics. You also have the body, which is a national program that enhances AI capability and promotes ethical AI. It's called the AI Singapore. You also have, say, for example, in Australia, you have the CISRO, which is like a research centers. They focus a lot on inclusive development, not just for industry, but also for indigenous as well. Like they have the Indigenous Knowledge Institute that promotes the integration of indigenous knowledge in AI, the cultures, the languages. So even amongst the First Nation people here in Australia, there are many different countries. They are not all the same, and they all have their own dialects. And so we need to take that into consideration. I think the Canadians are doing that. They have a lot of kind of working group with the government that help to integrate indigenous perspective into AI development, the opportunities and the potential are just endless, right? So in the past, we keep using these languages, these indigenous or these ancient languages, or even the way they write. But now it can all be captured because AI can process this data a lot faster and they can keep it. And yeah, so those are just some of the progress that's happening in Asia. For example, Laos government have done an MOU with the Chinese looking at AI to improve its agricultural industry. The Singapore government they just signed an MOU with the French government looking at AI in the context of defense. It's been applied in many different industries, depending on the country's level of AI readiness, but also depending on what is important and what are the priorities for that country. Because like I said, the readiness level, the infrastructure is not all the same in Asia. Yeah. So for example, in Southeast Asia or in China as well, most of the AI are applied in, say, healthcare industry because we have an aging population, which is a real concern. For example, maybe about 6 years ago, I was in Japan and the number of people turning 20 years old is only 1% of Japanese population. That's a real concern. So who's going to take care of the elder, right? So that's a big issue. And it's happening in China. It will happen in Singapore as well. So that's a key thing. And number two, another area that's pretty much being used in Asia is facial recognition and surveillance. So Singapore airport, I'm sure you've been to, it's super efficient. You can get from the gate to your luggages and then out in less than 15 minutes, right? Because they have basically changed the passport and the custom, and so it makes it very easy for people to come in and out. And in some other countries like China, they're using facial recognition extensively for public security. Like I said, collective harmony and security is really important. Identity verification, and also to reduce crime in most areas of the country. And so law enforcement purposes is quite big. Singapore is also exploring that. You also have big application in e-commerce and retail. So location marketing, location promotion, but also using it in logistics and supply chain so that the whole entire experience for the customer is seamless. You have big application in healthcare like telemedicine, diagnostics, and also pharmaceutical research. So basically using AI to discover and also personalize all this medicine, but more importantly, to shorten the time being used in finding out the right sequencing for all kinds of DNA research. And of course, in Singapore, because it's a financial hub and a trading hub for the region, AI is also being used prevalently in financial services, in fintech. And of course, Singapore is very big on their Green Plan 2030 goals and missions. So they wanted to build smarter cities. They want to have better urban management. They want to be able to measure the quality of life by looking at the quality of air, looking at the food people eat, how do we make sure that the public healthcare service is seamless, is effective, is efficient, doesn't have a lot of waste. And of course, people also tend to forget that Southeast Asia is also the fourth largest manufacturers of the world. Your clothes, the clothes that you wear, the EV that you drive, a lot of it comes from Asia. So AI is also being applied in a lot of manufacturing.
It's interesting to note that deploying the features that you've talked about is certainly easier in Singapore than it is in China. There are less blind spots or potential blind spots in Singapore because of the compact territory than it would be in China, where outside of the large cities, there are a lot of rural areas that have little internet access, Wi-Fi, as you mentioned before. So implementing all these features in large territories, not just China, but Russia or other
Australia
countries
as
such as
well.
Mongolia or Australia, it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah. So
So
Australia.
you mentioned some of the...
No, go ahead.
Yes, Australia. Okay. So you mentioned some of the key preoccupations such as healthcare in Asia specifically, but you see that there are differences in preoccupations around AI development in Europe compared to Australia, Singapore, and largely?
Yeah, so I think for Europe, the application a lot has got to do with, for example, in Switzerland, they're looking into banking system, trading system. So that's great. That's also very interesting. But also looking at the governance piece, I think this time I go to Europe, it seems to be the focus. How do we make these human-centric design and making sure that, yeah, it's going to be ethically used and it's not going to be people's privacy and security are not going to be abused. So I think that's again the prevalent conversation that I keep having with people. How do we make this sustainable? You have to use a lot of data to turn out a lot of meaningful information for people to design this AI. But these data centers are sucking up energy like crazy. So how do you make sure that we make these data centers sustainable, environmentally sustainable? Like in Singapore, we're the first country in the world to have a moratorium on the data center that the Facebook is having. So they were just literally telling Facebook, look, I get that you need all these data and you need to have these data centers, but you're not allowed to do it in Singapore. So they have to do it across the border, like in Indonesia. So I think more and more countries are going to look at that. Either you come up with technologies that's going to help reduce the energy consumption and to make sure that there's going to be a lot less of footprints. And then in some other countries, they're going to think more about in the area of security, privacy, and so on and so forth. So those are just some of the things that I observed. Yeah.
Maybe we will not get into the power that these large corporations have financially, which sometimes that they have more financial foothold or platform or just ability than many countries. So they are able, if Singapore says no, they're able to find someone else who will host their data servers or services and abuse some of the laws existing in countries where they reach. So
Yeah.
it's difficult to completely isolate a country. Even China, who decided not to have certain technologies available, have citizens finding ways using VPN
Yeah.
or other to access them. So it's very difficult to have the complete isolation.
Yeah, so this is why the UN bodies like the UN is so important, because then they can have this conversation globally by saying, okay, I'll give you an example. If this corporation comes into one country and basically pay people below decent wage and say, okay, you're going to be paid $1 per hour, your people, to manufacture these products that I want them to manufacture and then sell in big companies like Walmart and so on. And then the country's government said, we no longer can accept that. You need to pay fair wages, like maybe much, much more. And then the corporation can say, if that's the case, then I'll take it somewhere else where people don't ask this kind of question, right? So again, you keep having these corporations abusing these rights, and they just go around the region and find a government that is less acceptable to these kind of compliance. But if you have an international body like the UN or any kind of institute that say, you know what, we should not, or we should all not accept this kind of standards, environmental standards, human rights standards, and so on. If everyone can agree, then it lifts the whole standard globally. So then when it comes to data centers, then the Facebook of the world can't just go to another country. And because Indonesia now also have a higher standard for carbon emission or energy consumption and stuff like that. So then human beings would then be forced to, instead of rotating these problems around the world, they will then be forced to come up with a real sustainable solution, right? So it's the same thing with these AI governance. The international body can come up with a framework that is more or less fundamentally there to protect human rights, to make sure that our information, our data, our privacy are not going to be abused and people are not going to be hurt, and there are less scams, or we can find a mechanism to control scams and so that vulnerable people are not getting taken advantage of, then we would then achieve some level of responsibility for one another. Yeah.
Or maybe we can compare that challenge to the picture of herding cats.
Yes, said.
We talked about the different ethics
Yeah.
in across different cultures.
Yeah.
To what extent do Asian, European, or American culture values cross-pollinate and mutually influence each region's AI ethics and fairness approaches.
Yeah, I think in general, I think everyone fundamentally believes that you do not do harm, right? You do not do evil. And I think at some point, I think the Google slogan was that as well. And it's a great thing that we live in a global village, right? Globalization is being blamed for a lot of things, but it's also good to some extent because it has lifted so many people out of poverty over the last 50, 60 years or so. So you have this culture of entrepreneurial spirit exporting from the US in terms of the digital space to the rest of the world. Asia has always been very entrepreneurial since the dawn of time. And I think just merging and having this cross-pollination of you bring in this technology, I bring in this cultural sensitivity so that you have a better entrance to the market. And then the other culture or the other actor or the stakeholders within the picture said, okay, you bring in technology, my people will bring in the co-creation of these products so that we have much market relevance, and I'll bring in the governance framework. And my governance framework is going to be educated by ethics. And ethics is obviously educated by the philosophy and the culture that you grew up with. You don't know what you don't know. So by basically making sure that everyone is on the table, making sure that everyone's voices are being heard, you may think of things that you have never thought of, right? Because we just don't know and we just take these things for granted. How do you define sustainability in one culture versus another culture? The indigenous people and some Asian cultures have been practicing sustainability, recycling, reusing for hundreds of years, right? Because back then we didn't have a lot of resources. We didn't really have abundance. So you just have to reuse and reuse again. And now sustainability or sustainable practice is considered to be something that everyone is trying to adopt now, especially after COVID. It's slightly more in our psyche. So I think the wider you get in terms of perspective, the more richer and the smarter you are. Why wouldn't you want to pick the best from all different cultures and all different walks of life? Now, why do you restrict yourself to just one form of intelligence or one form of information and knowledge? So yeah, that's how we see it. The more the merrier.
So, how difficult is it to correlate the diversity of backgrounds and the trading to cultural sensitivities when building culturally competent teams to work together on AI projects?
I think the biggest thing is communication barriers. Languages and cultural differences can lead to a lot of misunderstanding. So humor is a big thing, right? People who exercise humor at work, right? For some cultures, it's not funny to make fun of someone who is a penny pinching person, and so some other culture they take it very offensive, and then some other culture they just think it's a joke. For some other culture, talking about marital affairs is considered quite a funny thing, whereas the other people frown upon. And also communication style, right? The way Asian communicate with elderly people is very different, right? We tend to be more respectful and so on. But in other culture, it's not that they don't respect the elders, it's just that it's a slightly more flat sort of cultural structure. So when you're training your team, when you're talking to your team, and people come from different age group, people come from different cultural background, religious background, so then you need to be a little bit more sensitive if you want to come up with a team that has trust with one another. Because again, other than unconscious bias, we also tend to also take a lot of things for granted, right? So if you want to cross-cultural collaborate on AI, you definitely need to take into consideration the different communication style, work ethics. Some people believe that you can work from 9 to 9 p.m. Well, when I was in my 20s working in Asia, I remember, we don't leave the office until our bosses leave, right? And then even after our bosses leave, you hang out with your colleagues to build that relationship. Whereas in Western Australia or in Australia, 9 to 5 p.m., that's it, gone. You have your own private life, you have your own family, and that's it. You don't mix those two. So those are the cultural differences when it comes to working. And then you also have trust and respect, right? In some cultures, trusts are being built based on transaction. And some other culture, trust is being built based on reciprocity, right? The difference between the two of them is one believes that when I give you something, I ask something back from you. Whereas for another culture, the first kind of culture is considered very insulting, very offensive. You don't talk about what you want in return. You just expect the person to respond and reciprocate when the time is right. Those are just the kind of things that people need to understand. Of course, this also comes back to not just communication, but eventually making business decision and also negotiating, right? You want to do the AI development in a certain way. You needed to raise funds in a certain way. And then in other cultures, it's been seen as very different. It's based on relationship. It's based on the way you have projected yourself over time, track record and everything. Whereas in other cultures, salesmanship is more important. Less about doing, more about talking and painting this beautiful dream and selling the dream. So that's very different. And of course, that also influenced the way people make decisions in regulations, in laws. How do you navigate these differences in different environments, especially when you're a global company, is also very important. Yeah.
Would you say that there are parts of the world where it is more or less difficult to build these teams?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, definitely. Some cultures, they may speak English fluently, but the way they think, the way they consult the hierarchy within the office, the way they make decisions is quite different, right? Just look at 2 years ago, a lot of companies are moving towards sustainability and they needed funds in order to transition their business into cleaner energy or to provide services that would meet those goals. But when you look at some banks, the people in the middle, for example, if they don't understand anything, they're not going to extend the loan because nobody wants to make a mistake and because nobody wants to lose pay, right? So what they do is they wait for other people, wait for their bosses with very clear directives, and then they do something, right? But then the Singapore government has already made it very clear to these banks, like by 2025, we will not be extending any loan to any company that are in the dirty energy sector, right? The fossil fuel sectors. So then how are we going to help companies to transition fast enough when no one is taking the risk in assessing the sustainable potential of some of these companies, right? So you have the pure players who are already providing sustainable solutions to all kinds of industry like construction, agriculture, and so on. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. You have the guys who are probably in the dead zone, who are literally in a coal, in a fossil fuel. And then most of the companies are actually in the middle, right? So they're transitional companies and you need to help them, right? They have oil and gas storage and they want to change it into hydrogen. But that needs investment. You need to help them to get there. Otherwise, they can't reach those targets. We can't just reject them and say, nah, they're in the dirty energy and therefore we're not interested in helping them. So it's the same thing with AI, right? You're going to have a huge part of your workforce that is full on. It's, oh yeah, we see the value, we know how to do this, so on and so forth. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who say, this is just a fad, it will go away, it's got nothing to do with me, I don't want this. And they're the silent killers, right? And then the majority part of your workforce would be people who are like, okay, we get it. We hear it in the news, we hear it in Facebook all the time on social media. We have to do something about it. Do we upskill? Do we cross-skill? Who's going to pay for it? How long is this transition? Whose responsibility is it? So I think these are just some of the conversations that a lot of organizations are having now, a lot of governments are having now, and even at the UN. So yeah, it will be interesting. But we need to make sure that people are brought on board on this journey, right? So you're going to have cultural differences. You're going to have business challenges during this time of disruption. So the key thing is, do you provide a platform for people to collaborate and to make sure that they have this healthy dialogue to come up with solutions that are going to be relevant for everyone, right? Do you provide the right training and education for everyone, not just from a national level, but also from a sector level and then on an individual level? And then you also have policies to protect these people, policies to help enforce these policies, and also to promote a healthy AI development. Yeah.
So what are some promising initiatives or frameworks that promote collaborative and inclusive AI development across cultures?
I think at the moment, it's not really firmed up yet. Like different countries have different needs, and so they have different initiatives here and there. And like I said previously before, in Australia, you had these initiatives where you have these research centers, and then you also have these institutes that look at capturing these indigenous knowledge and their culture and their history and their tradition. And then in Singapore, you have some bodies like the AI Singapore, where they work with different key sectors that will be disrupted by AI. They look at it from a policy perspective, governance perspective, but also from an innovative entrepreneurship perspective as well. So they're encouraging people to give as much information as possible so that we can, with all this information, you can come up with a more rigorous conversation and dialogue. But at the moment, every country is doing their own thing, right? In some countries, they are more concerned about disinformation and information because it's also an election year. So a lot of countries are also a bit concerned about how AI is going to create all these misinformation, disinformation in their campaigns. And in some other countries, it's more about, oh, I have a huge mining sector. So how can AI help us reduce waste, improve productivity and output? And in some other countries, it's more focusing on manufacturing. And in some service sectors or countries, they are very keen on exploring how AI is going to affect their digital commerce sector or even call centers like in the Philippines and also in India. So they're all looking at that at the moment. So I would say like different countries have different concerns, different priorities, different priority sectors. And so they are looking at it from different approach. But like I said, we're such a global village now. You can't say, I'm doing this business and therefore I'm just going to focus domestically. We were in that kind of, how should I say, a little bit of that kind of mindset during COVID. But now that COVID is not affecting us that much anymore, it's under control. So people who have workforce overseas or they have businesses overseas, they're starting to do this integration again. And a lot has got to do with this communication and getting as much richer data as possible into the system.
It seems that in Europe and in the US, the main actors are essentially private companies or private corporations.
Yeah.
What is the situation in Asia? What is the balance between independent, large corporations, organizations, and organizations or institutes that are controlled by state?
Yeah, so again, it all goes back down to the culture, right? In some cultures, it's absolutely okay to be super entrepreneurial and then to amass a ridiculous amount of wealth, the size of the GDP of 2-3 countries. That's considered normal, right? Good for the guy. He's entrepreneurial, he's innovative, he makes a lot of money, and therefore it's okay and don't have to pay a lot of tax. Whereas in some other cultures, it's different. Some other culture, they tend to question, is it actually normal to have one person amassing so much wealth? Isn't that abnormal? And without paying tax or paying very little tax, a lot of that wealth is not being translated into public infrastructure. It's not translated into welfare system or even education system or healthcare system that is going to help those people who are not on that techno kind of journey or that kind of Kool-Aid journey. So is it normal? So for some people, it's individual responsibility and individual rights. For some other cultures, it's really about what is good for the society is going to be good for me, rather than what is good for me is good for me. So it's a little bit different. And also in some cultures, they believe that I vote for the government or I believe in this particular party, and therefore this government has the far side, has the resources, has the ability to see things larger than just my family and my community, and therefore they have the responsibility to take care of us, right? And so how does a government take care of its people? And again, this goes back into different philosophies, different cultures, and so on. So the way some government takes care of its people is let them be, right? Give them the freedom to do whatever they want. And when things go bad, then you come in with the policies and legislation. Whereas in some other cultures, it's very different. It takes on a more patriarchal kind of relationship. Like, I know best. I will take care of you. You may not like it as an individual. What, in 10 years' time, this is going to be better for the society. So it's not up to us to judge one culture versus another. So therefore, it's also hard for us to judge one government against the other. We can have our own opinion, and everyone is entitled to their own opinion. But like I said, things can only be told through time. What is good for us 15 years ago with social media is considered to be disastrous for some 17 years later, right? I would also like to encourage people to look at this whole thing about industrialization, the history of industrialization. For some, it was good. For some others, it was horribly disruptive, and not everyone was being brought onto that journey. Whatever we do, we just have to go with the time. We have to be agile. We have to be adaptable. But at the same time, let's not repeat the same mistake we keep subjecting ourselves to. Let's try to make sure that seeing that this is going to disrupt more than 50% of the world population, it's going to make a lot of jobs redundant. Let's just try and do this a little bit smarter. Yeah.
What you just said is very interesting. I want to take this into another aspect that I think deserves also attention. It's about data fairness, transparency, and how algorithms are used, accessibility and usability, and social impact. And maybe we have to ask ourselves how confident we can be in data originating from certain countries, and how it is used to train AI, and how it gives a fair and balanced perspective of the true social, economic, and social cultural diversities existing within and across some of those countries. So I don't want to pinpoint Asia because I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's only an Asian problem. It can be also a European problem. There are some countries that have decided that the democracy is not the right way to go. So it can be Europe, it can be Africa. So it's not just an Asian problem.
Yeah. And also you have this term called ethical innovation now coming up. Even last year when I was in Europe, looking at how do we make innovation more ethical? How do we apply innovation more ethically? Again, my perspective is like when I look at Confucianism from an Asian perspective, I see that there's a lot of social benefit in not just creating a technology that is going to be good for our everyday lives, but it's also going to be socially beneficial for us. The Confucianism and the Buddhism, for example, they have these philosophy, and these are the three philosophy that governs most of our culture. Number one, you're looking at self-reflection. Number two, self-cultivation, and then self-enlightenment, number three. Yeah. So when you use these three philosophies to govern our everyday lives, including innovation, then you will look at it from quite a different lens. So when you look at benevolence, Ren, Chinese language Ren, as a leader of a country or as a leader of a corporation, when you look at benevolence, right, you often ask yourself, how can this technology prioritize human welfare? Rather than how can this technology make the most money for me? So earlier this year, I was at Davos. I was sitting in one of the sessions where will.i.am, this American musician, was talking about how he has invested in these coding programs for Black young fellows to learn, and to African American to learn about these coding, to make sure that their insights and their preferences and their hobbies and their interests are being input into this level of development. And he was saying that there is no doubt that AI is going to change our lives forever. But the only thing he really has a huge worry is greed, right? We have all kinds of governance to help us do the right thing. But in terms of greed, some cultures are slightly more stricter and some other cultures are not, right? So how do we actually improve the lives of the humans, and how do we address the existing social issue that we have? So that's one thing, Ren, right? Benevolence, right? So we advocate for all kinds of action that would promote the kind of technology that will help humans flourish. And then you had Yi, right? Yi is a Chinese word for righteousness. So in terms of the innovation that you have developed, does it adhere to ethical standards? And whether this particular standard is right, is justice, right? So this means you will try to avoid any kind of deployment or even development of AI that could actually harm individual or society. For example, biased algorithms or invasive surveillance or all kinds of technology that hurt human beings. And then you have Li. Li is the proper conduct, like a etiquette that is the societal norms and customs according to our culture. And so this particular word is, how do you ensure that the AI development also respects cultural values and social norms of different people from different backgrounds? Can we look at AI and say, how can we make AI not just less biased, but how can we use AI to promote more acceptance, right? More acceptance of people with differences, different gender preferences, sexual preferences, different kind of religious background, but also how can we minimize conflict? Minimize, right? So this is also, again, it goes back to our culture because conflict is a big no. Harmony is actually more important. So you do not confront someone, you do not argue with someone, you do not debate with someone. Again, this is just a very Asian is just one culture. There are Middle East culture, there's African culture, there is South American culture. And so when we see it through those lens in terms of ethical innovation, it's another layer of richness that we can add to this human-centric design. So hopefully,
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you mentioned that's this in terms of conflict.
Yeah.
Because sometimes evading conflict
It's
leaves not often almost always, if you evade conflict, you are not giving yourself the opportunity to resolve it. It remains unresolved.
Yeah.
It's something that you continue to carry with you because it has not been resolved.
Yeah. So I think for the Asian culture is we understand that there are challenges and difficulties in life, at work, or even in any kind of social interaction, and we don't like conflict. And there are problems, but we find other ways around it. So yes, you're right. Sometimes it's not a good thing to basically not talk about it and not resolve it. You're depriving yourself the potential of coming out with something bigger, greater. But with the culture, it's not that they don't achieve these solutions in the end. They do. They just go about different ways, right? Ways that are less abrasive, ways that are less aggressive, and also ways that are less, how should I say, offensive to other people's face. So dignity, face, like we always find a way to save face for other people. Yeah.
I'm sharing this because I'm a mediator. I'm a
Yeah.
trained mediator,
Yeah.
and that's what I do. Try to get to transform the relationship between people who are in a situation of conflict in order to first transform the relationship and then get them to, because you've transformed the relationship and foster understanding,
Yeah.
to get them to work on the issue and find themselves a solution that is agreeable for the both of them and not have someone come in the middle and decide what is the best way.
Yes, correct. Yeah. I think trust is the biggest issue. I think like all things, it's a no-brainer to adopt AI or any kind of innovation that can bring us from one end to the other end. But the biggest problem that we have with change management, like all things, whether it's to come up with an agreement, whether it's to come up with something that both people can agree to work on, workable solution, it often goes back to trust. If people don't trust technology, if people don't trust the people who are using or advocating for this technology, people are not going to use it, or people are not going to use it happily. And we want people to use it happily, constructively, right? Objectively. So, yeah, that's a big challenge. Yeah.
Before ending, because at one point we will have to
Yes, of
stop
course.
for today,
Sure.
I still want to talk about social impact assessment.
Yes,
The social impact assessment depends on the metric we apply to measure it.
sure.
Those would be different, not only across culture, but also influenced by political landscapes.
Of course. Yeah.
What should be done to minimize instrumentalization or weaponization?
Yeah. So I would like to advocate, being an advocate for the UN Sustainable Development Goals for the last 6 years. I would like everyone to use that as a reference, right? It doesn't matter whether you're from Africa or Singapore or Australia or the US. I think everyone can agree that those 17 goals signed by the 193 member states in 2015 is one that is rigorous and good enough for people to actually use as reference, right? We all want the world to be more sustainable. We all want the world to be more peaceful. So why don't we just use those guidelines? Like, how do we measure if whatever that we're going to do in the future is going to be good for our whole entire planet? Number one, it needs to basically look at those 17 goals and say, how are we hitting all those targets? So maybe some countries are hitting the innovation and economic empowerment a lot more than others. And in some other countries, it's more about reducing negative damage to the environment, reducing damage to the land, or reducing damage in the ocean. And then for some other countries, it could be about how do we improve health, right? How can we make education more accessible, higher quality for our people? And in some other cases, it could be like, how can we include more women? Or how can we make this more gender equal? To start off, I would say a good metric would be, again, going back to my value, right? And what I believe in, is this in harmony with the nature? Whatever we do with the AI, how is this in harmony with the nature? When I use the word harmony, how can we mitigate all the negative impact and how can we improve the positive impact? But more importantly, how can we integrate it in such a system that it minimizes all kinds of ecological footprints, whether it be reducing the ridiculous amount of energy that we need to consume for using these data or to extract this data, but also how do we actually have a more optimal energy consumption, right? How do we make this more sustainable for not just one industry, but across various industries? And then another barometer that I would like to use is not just a short-term one. I know it's really hard for some countries because you vote your government every 4 years or every 3 years. That's going to be tough. But if we can appeal to all government to take a more long-term perspective, right? So don't just measure yourself in 3 or 5 years. Also measure yourself in 10 years' time, right? How are you evaluating your long-term effects on not just the environment, but also the society? And make sure that it doesn't lead to any detrimental consequences, right? So the negatives are being reduced and the positives are being enhanced. And then also, I would also say, like, how do we measure ourselves in terms of not just learning, but also continuous education, right? In promoting a workforce that can drive innovation, that can ensure that all the professionals are equipped to handle this kind of evolving challenges that will come to us given the AI innovation. And more importantly, not just any kind of education, but also ethical learning, moral learning, to integrate all these considerations, not just by the guy who has a legal background, but also the guys who are engineers, the guys who are doing the operations, the guys who are delivering the services, the guys who are looking at marketing and advertising. In fact, advertising and marketing, you're going to see a huge abuse of AI in that sector. Looking at standards, looking at not just from a compliance and governance perspective, but also from a societal values perspective. How do we measure ourselves against that? And then, of course, finally, other things like how can we encourage more collaboration? Can a government demonstrate that they have actually formed MOUs, partnerships with different governments in developing AI that's going to be good for the region, good for economy, good for democracy, or good for peace, right? And then you also have other barometers like how have you reduced your inequality in your own country, in your own backyard? It's very easy to go around the world and say that, oh, you have this, you have that, or you're not doing it right, you're not doing it bad. Look at yourself and look at your own country and your own community. How have you actually helped close those gaps? It's easy to say, let's do this and let's export this and we're doing so great with innovation. But you have indigenous people living 500 kilometers away from you with no access to digital infrastructure, with no access to Wi-Fi. And because of that, they're deprived of all kinds of economic empowerment, all kinds of education, quality education. So I would say measure ourselves with that rigorously, criticize ourselves and subject ourselves to a rigorous evaluation as much as we do towards others. And of course, ask yourself, when you say transparency and responsibility, how do you measure yourself against that? Yeah, how do you measure yourself against that? I dare corporations to basically report and have a disclosure of the gender diversity, the cultural diversity of their coding and programming team. So if you can do that openly, well, you're already starting to do that with gender on their boards and also for their workforce. Why can't they do this for their coders and their programmers? And it will be very revealing. If you don't report on it, you can't measure it. You can't measure it. You can't improve it. I would say these are the metrics that are out there. It's available. People just need to ask themselves, am I going to do this because this is going to be good for my future and it's going to be good for the humankind, or is it going to be good for my pocket, or what? Is it a political decision or is it a human decision? So those are just some of the things that I would post forward for people to consider.
I am completely with you on wishing that we follow the guidelines that were given, and especially the last one, this there. Yeah, I'm fully behind you and wish that there was more transparency.
Yeah.
Regrettably, given the recent announcement by the Secretary General of the UN, we seem to be moving quite far away by the goals that we set ourselves, and not the furthest one, but the nearest one, 2030. So that's a bit concerning. And I hope that the political landscapes in the different countries that seems to be bringing about rights will not have too big of a negative impact on moving towards the goals that we set ourselves.
Yeah. It's always painful, right? When you set yourselves a goal long term, you're always going to concede, or you're going to always give up the short term gains to do the long term gains. Like you've seen this in political history all the time. It's really challenging to do something long term when you have a system that changes every few years. It's always going to be challenging, right? It's important to measure ourselves against short-term targets, but it's also important that you need to expand it to 10 years, 20 years, or like I said, the 7-generation stewardship, right? Can any government or any country at the moment confidently say that whatever that they're doing is going to be good for 7 generations? Some governments can't even do it for 1 generation.
But there's also the ingrained or built-in resistance to change in human brain that makes this really hard to overcome.
But it's not like it's never done before. So if you look at some of the ancient cultures, like the First Nation people or cultures that have been around for thousands of years, just look at how they make these decisions. And it's not like we've never done it before. It's just a political will. We've done it before, so we can adopt it. Yeah.
So before we conclude, is there something that you feel that we would still talk about, or something that you'd like to mention that we forgot to bring up?
No, I think it's a very good interview. Kudos to you for getting every answer out of me and preparing a very good interview. Thank you very much, Gabor. It's a real pleasure to share my thought leadership. And like I said, it's just one person, one lens. There are billions of lenses out there. Yes, it's exhaustive. Yes, it's tiresome to get different perspectives to come in, and you obviously will have disagreements and differences and conflict. But like we have studied at Harvard Business School, when you want to come up with breakthrough ideas, you've got to have diversity. And I think human beings are now at this juncture where we can do something really amazing and great to solve the problems and the challenges that we have in terms of equality, in terms of the environment, climate impact, and in terms of reducing poverty. We can achieve that. And I believe that human beings can do that. We just need to work together. And hopefully AI will be there as an extension of us human beings to solve those problems in the time that we can't do it just by ourselves. I see the AI development as a positive, constructive thing rather than something that I'm afraid of. I could be easily going down this rabbit hole of looking at all the horrible things that it could actually have a very, very destructive impact to our lives. I tend to want to say that, look, we are still at the very beginning of this conversation, this journey. Let's nudge it in the right direction. Let's do this right so that we don't have to worry for our future generation.
Thank you very much for your insights. And maybe we can have another conversation in the near future and see how things have evolved.
Yeah, sounds good, Gabor. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabor.